If you've been following our journey for a while now, then chances are you've heard us say something like this.
Plus, speaking about this fenced-in area, we also have to finish this darn fence. It was around that time that we also started erecting a fence to keep the deer out, but, well, that's still a work in progress. And finally, our fence. We really need to finish the darn thing.
But all of this is certainly due to our lack of completed fence, so who can blame the critters for filling their hungry bellies? And because we're just so darn consistent, our fence is still left unfinished. But I swear, this is the year. You see, we first started our fence back in 2016, but until recently hadn't really made much progress. And judging by your comments, quite a few of you have noticed. So in this video, we'd like to present part 2 of what we're now calling a short series of videos on slowly but surely constructing our garden fence. The first part, published toward the end of 2019, was all about our garden layout and the installation of our fence posts. In it, we covered the dimensions of our beds, the reasoning behind our choices, and even the math of mapping out a perfect square on your land. We also talked about why we used cedar posts and how we set them in the ground without the use of cement. So if you haven't seen it or can't recall the details, we've placed a link in the description and encourage you to check it out. And while we're at it, I know that some of you are likely in a hurry. So to make things a bit easier, I've also added a table of contents so that you can jump to the specific portion of the video that you're interested in. I hope that helps. But for everyone else, I think we should take a moment to discuss the plan for the rest of this series. And in order to do that, we should probably start by reminding you why we decided to build the fence in the first place. Critters. You see, getting closer to nature was one of our main motivations for moving back to the country, and wild animals are about as naturey as you can get. However, as much as we love to see them, watch them, name them, and in some cases even feed them, sometimes we all just need our own space. So, just like our house is meant to keep the critters out of our living room, we figured a fence would be the best option for keeping them out of our garden. Now, as some of you have pointed out, there are also far more aggressive options available. But we felt that a simple barricade was much more in line with our own personal philosophy. All are safe and welcome, but some spaces are private. Okay, but to fully appreciate the task at hand, we'll also have to get to know the critters a little bit. For example, our first furry friends to find our fenceless farm were the rabbits and groundhogs. Adorable, curious, and downright ferocious when it comes to homegrown veggies, these guys are mostly a close-to-the-ground kind of invader. But boy, can they dig. And they're not the only ones. Because as we discovered last year in our potato patch, the mice and voles are pretty impressive tunnelers as well. They're tiny and unassuming, but under the cover of mulch, they'll make an absolute feast of your tubers. So part 2 of our fence series, aka this video, will cover our attempt at keeping the smaller digging animals out of our garden. And we'll throw in some personalized protection against pesky plants as well. Then in part 3, we'll talk about the larger animals like deer, who don't really dig or climb but can easily leap over tall buildings. Well, maybe not buildings, but you get the idea. And finally, in part 4, we'll attempt to outsmart the problem-solving raccoons, because not only can they devour an entire corn patch in a single evening, but they can also climb and solve puzzles. So dealing with them without resorting to violence can be a real test of your patience. But we've happily accepted the challenge and hope to find something that works. So that's the overall plan, but for right now, let's get back to the diggers. When trying to keep out small ground-dwelling animals, I think the problem can be broken down into 2 parts: keeping them from walking in and keeping them from tunneling in. The first part is pretty simple, so we can get that one out of the way right off the bat. Essentially, we just need a mini fence that's difficult to chew. There are, of course, many fencing options to choose from, but we decided to go with 1/4-inch stainless steel hardware cloth. Stainless because it's less likely to rust, and 1/4-inch because that should hopefully be small enough to prevent anyone from squeezing their tiny bodies through. Now, if we were only concerned about bunnies and groundhogs, then 3/4-inch would likely have been more than sufficient. However, we also hope to slow down the mice and voles as well. You see, for most rodents, the only limiting factor is the size of their skull. And in the case of young mice, that means about the diameter of a pencil. And for adults, about the diameter of a dime. So despite the slightly increased cost, we figured that 1/4-inch hardware cloth might still be worth it. But again, when it comes to really small animals, I think it's best to aim for slowing them down rather than stopping them completely. As for the height of the fence, most seem to recommend somewhere between 2 and 3 feet. That should be tall enough to prevent rabbits and hares from jumping it and groundhogs from climbing it. In our case, we felt comfortable with a slightly shorter height, but mostly because we knew that we'd also be adding additional fencing above that point in part 3, so stay tuned for that. Now, when trying to prevent small animals from tunneling, there appear to be 2 primary options. The first and most obvious choice is to simply extend your fencing materials straight down into the ground. That way, any hungry bunnies with visions of carrot roots dancing in their heads will instead be met with disappointment. But again, these little guys are expert diggers, and a hungry belly can be an impressive motivator. So most recommend that the fencing should be buried at least a foot or more deep, and for extra security should even form an L shape at the bottom. That way, if they do happen to make it all the way down, they'll now have to contend with a new and likely confusing obstacle. Of course, this is not a guarantee, but assuming you visit your garden every day, then this method should at least buy you enough time to catch them in the act and foil their attempts. However, just because the critters are expert diggers doesn't mean that we are, and digging a foot-deep trench all the way around the 200-foot perimeter of our garden is not a particularly desirable prospect, especially considering the effort that was already involved in just digging the post holes. So that brings us to option 2. Simply adding an L shape along the surface. Now, at first, this may not seem like a very effective solution. Couldn't the animals just lift up the flimsy wire and crawl underneath? Well, sure, but there are several ways to avoid that. For example, you could simply remove the sod layer, add the fencing, and then drop the sod back down. Now you end up with an equally impenetrable physical barrier that requires a similar level of problem solving to breach. However, if lifting 200 feet of sod still sounds like a fair amount of work, then the other option is to just fasten the fencing to the ground, either with a heavy weight or some of these inexpensive garden staples. Over time, the grass will grow up through the wire mesh and get so tangled that the fence and the sod become one and the same. Eventually, you'll be able to mow right over top of it and no one will be the wiser. So I think that's probably the simplest solution, but we do have a quick word of warning. A couple of years ago, we decided to try this method on 2 sides of the garden, just to see if it would work. You can actually see it in the background of some of our older footage. And for the most part, it did exactly what we had hoped. The grass quickly grew up through it, and we were eventually brave enough to bring out the mower. The first pass was very encouraging, because you couldn't even tell that it was there. That was until we lowered the cut height, and then in a very short but very violent moment, the fencing was ripped from the ground and our lawnmower was tied into knots of twisted wire. I could practically hear the critters giggling in the distance. So if you decide to try this method for yourself, I'd recommend keeping your mower height a little higher for the first season or 2. I'm fairly confident that it would work well eventually, but there's no need to take any unnecessary risks in the meantime. Alright, so that's all the background info we need on the critter front, but I also mentioned that we wanted our fence to keep out pesky plants as well, and in particular, quackgrass. If you haven't seen our previous videos on this topic, please do check out the link in the description. It's a tenacious weed which has earned both our respect and ire over the past few years in the garden. So I won't go into much detail here because we've talked about it before and we'll definitely be talking about it again. But the most relevant bit for this video is that among other things, quackgrass spreads through rhizomes. Thick, tough, underground stems with needle-sharp tips. They have enough stored energy to travel further than you'd think and enough growth points to sprout up anywhere along their length. So winning the battle against this worthy foe requires 2 simultaneous strategies: removing it where it's already become established, and preventing it from sending in reinforcements from the outside. That is where the fence comes in. Again, we've covered this idea in detail in that original video, but essentially our plan is to create a wide perimeter around the garden fence using a form of sheet mulching. The hope is that if it's wide enough, the quackgrass will struggle to send in new rhizomes, allowing us to focus on the primary battleground inside the garden fence. But oh my goodness, that will be a whole other video. So for now, let's get started on our combined solution for both plant and animal invaders. Our first step was to mow the grass surrounding our fence posts and up against the edge of our mulch-covered beds. I did this in several stages, cutting closer and closer to the ground with each pass. The idea here is to remove as much of the above-ground vegetation as possible to force the below-ground portion to use up their stored energy when attempting to recover their losses. But of course, our second step is to prevent them from doing so, using sheet mulching. This part was pretty simple, essentially just covering the ground with overlapping layers of cardboard. But you'll want to plan ahead for this part because it takes a lot of cardboard. Like A lot. But luckily, our brother-in-law works in a warehouse that goes through mountains of boxes pretty much every day. So with just a quick phone call and a couple trips into town, we were set. Oh, and the best part was that the company normally has to pay to dispose of what they consider a waste product. So as far as they were concerned, we were doing them a favor by taking it away for free. Win-win. Unfortunately though, since nothing is ever truly free in this world, the cardboard did come with some strings attached. Or rather, not strings, but tape. And lots of it. So before we could begin using it in the garden, we first had to spend several days peeling off tape and labels. But once we got into a rhythm, this was a surprisingly relaxing activity spent outside in the sunshine. So that's still a win in my books. Oh, and I should also mention that cardboard can be a bit of a controversial subject when it comes to its use in the garden, mostly due to the glues and other chemicals that are used in its production. We recently mentioned this in our video about paper seedling pots, and then, like now, I think the great paper debate is out of scope for the moment. However, in our case, since we're only using it around our fence and on our paths, rather than on our actual growing area, we decided that the risks were outweighed by the benefits. But as usual, please do your own research in order to find a solution that you are comfortable with. Anyway, back at the fence, we continued laying out cardboard, and since its purpose was to smother out the grass, we decided to leave the boxes intact, rather than tearing them open. This meant that each box covered a smaller surface area, but also meant that the cardboard was laid out 2 layers thick, and 4 in the case of the overlaps. Our hope was that this extra thickness would increase its effective smothering time. Again, quackgrass rhizomes are tough, determined, and needle-sharp, so any sign of weakness would surely be exploited. Then, once we had the first row of cardboard down along the side of the garden bed, we immediately began an overlapping second row as well. Our plan here was to extend out from the fence perimeter by about a foot or so. You'll see why in a moment. And when we came to a fence post, we simply used a utility knife to cut out a notch. These don't have to be perfect, but again, the point is to cover as much of the grass as possible. So the tighter, the better. We also found that in most cases, the scrap piece of cardboard could be shoved up against the post to help fill in any gaps. Oh, and at the time, we weren't sure how we were going to deal with the gateway into the fence, but the grass had to be smothered either way, so we just covered it up the same as the rest. Then, once all the cardboard was down, it was finally time for the hardware cloth. Since our garden is 50 by 50, we purchased 4 rolls that were 50 feet long and 3 feet wide. This would allow for an L-shaped fence with both the vertical and horizontal sections each measuring 1.5 feet. But again, if we weren't later going to be adding an upper section to the fence, then we probably would have used larger rolls in order to achieve a height of 2 to 3 feet instead. Our first step was to roll out the fencing and then stretch it between the 2 end posts. Once we were confident that they were at the right height, I threw in a few staples just to hold it in place. Then we went from post to post with Paula confirming the height and me adding a few more staples. Finally, once each of the posts were attached and everything was correct, we made a second pass, adding staples all the way to the ground level. The next morning, we removed the logs that we had placed on the loose cardboard to keep it from blowing away overnight, and then quickly got back to work. This time, using our measuring tape as a rough straight edge, we added the final row of cardboard outside the fence, on top of the hardware cloth. This layer should not only help to keep the hardware cloth in place, but will also help to smother out the grass for an additional 3-foot wide perimeter outside the garden. And then finally, we covered the cardboard, both inside and out, with a thick layer of sawdust as mulch. We'd originally intended to use wood chips for this step, but changed our mind for 2 reasons. First, we had heard from others online that sawdust was surprisingly effective at weed control and made for some seriously comfortable walking paths. And second, and most important, we found a nearby sawmill with mountains of natural sawdust, who upon first meeting practically begged us to take it away for free. So, as I've said before, the best mulch is the mulch you have access to, and this deal was too good to pass up. Now, we weren't super particular with the thickness, but aimed for roughly 6 inches, and then did our best to rake it smooth. Afterward, I packed it all down with this tamper that we had borrowed from my stepfather about 5 years ago, and so, since he's likely to watch this video, I suspect he'll finally have to return it. Anyway, that was it for the first side, and then the other 3 were more of the same. Laying cardboard, stapling hardware cloth, and eventually covering it all with sawdust. Then finally, for the corners, we used a square section of hardware cloth with a slit cut along one side to allow it to wrap more easily around the post. Then, once again, we sheet mulched over top, did a bit of tidying, and that was it. So now that everything's complete, we've got a layer of cardboard that spans from just under the mulch of our bed to about a foot outside the fence. Then we have our hardware cloth that extends up and out by 1.5 feet, followed by our uppermost layer of cardboard and 6 inches of sawdust. The final result is not only a fence that should be difficult to tunnel under, but also approximately 6 feet of sheet mulching, which should deter even the most aggressive of quackgrass rhizomes. Or at least, that's the hope. But since this all happened last season, we can now talk a bit about how well it worked throughout the remainder of that year. Over time, the sawdust packed down into a comfortable walking path, and for the most part has kept the quackgrass and other weeds completely at bay. We did still have to keep an eye out for any weak spots, especially around the fence posts, but overall it seems to be holding up incredibly well. Even when a bit of grass did make it through, it was always quickly noticed and easily removed. As for the critters, well, the proof is in the pudding, because none of our veggies were eaten by bunnies or groundhogs last year, and this side-by-side comparison should illustrate the difference. So, all in all, we're very pleased with our initial results. However, as I mentioned, ground dwellers aren't the only animal threats that our garden must contend with, so we'll soon be focusing on the upper fence in parts 3 and 4. But in the meantime, thanks for watching, and we'll see you soon.